Start again. Sorry.
So start again.
Sorry.
Okay, starting again now. So hello and welcome to our second live stream talk from the Voltaic Community Hall. And we hope that you and your family and friends are all staying well during these curious times. We didn't know what to expect when we thought about doing these live stream events, but we were absolutely overwhelmed by the response from our first talk. So thank you all for those of you who watched it and gave us positive feedback, certainly encouraging us to do more of these. We are obviously forever grateful for the amazing people that have incredible stories that they're willing to share with us during these talks. And tonight is absolutely no exception to that. Our speaker tonight, Jonny Hawkins, is an outdoor enthusiast, maybe even a fanatic. And his primary passion is kayaking, and that's taken him to some really stupendous settings. He's kayaked in Venezuela, in Borneo, in Nepal, in New Zealand, and Scotland, and Hong Kong. And the subject for tonight's talk is the Inside Passage in Canada. So just yet another amazing location. Jonny is an outdoor instructor and leader, and if you're looking to enjoy the outdoors yourself and improve your skills, then I'd certainly recommend checking out his website at highlandadventureschools.co.uk. Anyway, that's more than enough from me. Let me now hand over to Jonny so he can tell you his story about the Inside Passage. And do remember to post your questions and comments on the panel, on the bar, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the talk. Okay, so over to you, Jonny, and welcome.
Great. Oh, thanks very much. And thanks very much for inviting me to come and talk. I remember coming last year to lots of the talks, and it was a really nice break from the wild and windy Voltaic weather. So it's nice to be able to sort of come along and give back to the community. So yeah, this evening I'm going to be talking about my trip, a sea kayaking trip up the Inside Passage, which is a Canadian waterway. And I was joined by my partner Amy Dunis in August 2019 for that trip. So it's been really nice actually preparing for the talk, looking back at the videos and the pictures and chatting through stories together. So if nothing else, I've enjoyed putting it together. So my name is Jonny Hawkins, originally from the sunny south, where I was born and bred, and that's where I started kayaking at the local canoe club, the IOT Centre. So massive thanks to all of the coaches there for getting me started, and then cool. So yeah, thanks to all the coaches for getting me started. But yeah, then moved up to Scotland for university, and that's where my paddling sort of career took off, I guess. So really enjoyed making friends and exploring the country through whitewater kayaking. And there's we've some talked about earlier, it's enabled me to travel around the world and paddle in all sorts of different countries. So really like kayaking, mostly whitewater kayaking. But at the end of university, I thought it'd be quite nice to do something a bit more local. So rather than paddling in my whitewater kayak, I thought a great way to explore the coastline of Scotland might be to do that in sea kayak. So haven't really paddled a sea kayak before then. So spent a few weekends going on courses and paddling with friends to work out what it was all about. And then just before I graduated, embarked on a trip around Scotland. So I think it was about 45 days of kayaking, joined with friends as well. So a great opportunity to explore the coastline a bit more. And I guess that sort of opened my eyes to what was possible in sea kayaking. It's a really good way of traveling because you can carry lots of stuff and it's not on your back. You can get up close and personal with all the wildlife. And it's a really good way to explore islands and more of the coastline at a different perspective. So it kind of ignited my passion, I suppose, for sea kayaking as well. So I'm an outdoor instructor now, and I've worked in Scotland for about 7 years. But I do like to sort of go to other countries, and spent a year working an outdoor centre in New Zealand called the Hillary Outdoor Centre. So hello, if anyone's listening from over there. So when I was out there, I met a lady called Amy Dunis, my partner in crime, and we decided, so we got together out there and started doing lots of trips and things. So this is a picture of us down in the South Island in the Remarkables. And we decided after a bit of kayaking and climbing there that we'd come back to the UK to start work back here. So Amy is an outdoor instructor, and that's how I met her. But now she runs a company called Adventurous Pencil, and this is one of her newest pieces of art. And hopefully at the end of the talk, you'll see what inspires her art through her trips. So yeah, when we got to the UK, we thought it'd be really good to plan a trip together and combine both of our passions for rock climbing and kayaking. So we decided to plan a trip to Lofoten Isles. And these amazing islands up in the north west of Norway, quite well in the Arctic Circle. And the plan was to spend a month there, and we'd go climbing when it was sunny and then go sea kayaking when it was wet. Once we'd done a bit of planning, we realised to get there it was going to be a 4-day drive. So with a 4-day drive there and a 4-day drive back, we didn't have a huge amount of time, but we managed to do some really cool trips, exploring the amazing coastline there, and also getting some rock climbing in, which was really good. I guess we learnt loads of things about expedition life over there, and for me, a big part of expeditions is the food that you eat. I really enjoyed learning how to catch the food. So this is a full line of mackerel, but possibly more importantly than catching it is learning how to cook it. And it was quite fun experimenting with cooking foods that matches your clothing as well. So this is one of our famous pink meals that we cooked out there. Once we got back, we had a great time and reflected upon the trip and thought, oh, wow, that was really good, but what can we do next? So we decided rather than taking the car this time, we would go somewhere a little bit further afield and do a trip without the car. So that raises sort of logistical problems like how you get boats and how you get back to the start point. But we wanted to do another sea kayaking trip, I guess, because it's a really good chance to experience the wild places. It offers quite a big challenge as well. So you can either pick quite a chilled out, low mileage trip where you get lots of chance to enjoy, or you can go the other end of the spectrum and paddle a long distance and have a real challenge to work towards. And I suppose or possibly more me than Amy, but I quite like the challenge side of things, the type 2 fun, where at the time it's maybe not that fun, but looking back it becomes fun. So we decided that the Inside Passage would be a really good place to go, and a good chance to explore a new country as well. So the plan was to fly across to Canada, to Vancouver, and then we would paddle up the coastline, up something called the Inside Passage, which is an amazing area of the world, really. It's a set of islands on the west coast of British Columbia and America that form lots of channels that weave their way up. And it goes from Washington to Alaska. So I guess previously the Inside Passage was used originally by the First Nations people when they're exploring and traveling across the country as a really safe way to travel up the coast. Later on, it was used by gold prospectors to chase the gold rush. And nowadays it's used by sea kayakers, but also cruise liners to go and explore quite an amazing stretch of coastline. So it kind of made sense as a sea kayaking route because for sea kayaking, you can paddle in fairly rough conditions, but the calmer it is, the more days you can paddle and the more progress you can make. So the fact that we could shelter behind the islands meant that we could plan quite a long trip and know that we weren't going to have to rest for too many days. It'd be a really good chance to look at the wilderness, and as opposed to being on a boat where you're fairly constrained and far from the rocks and the wildlife, in a sea kayak you can get up close and personal. So you might sneak around a corner and see a bird, or you might be eye level with an orca that breaches. We thought it'd be the perfect route. So this is a bit of a video of the route that we took. So we started on Vancouver Island, and you can see from this the sort of terrain that we were sea kayaking through. So loads and loads of islands, loads of channels, and the channels were quite narrow at times as well. So this is sort of traveling up to the north bit of Vancouver Island, and the only exposed bit was this section here where we crossed over to the mainland, and we had the Pacific swell coming up from the left-hand side. And then the channels got kind of narrower and narrower as we weaved through these islands and passed a few towns, but not that many. And this northern section was really amazing. You can see how tight the channel is here, and then it becomes even narrower a bit further up. And in places, it's about 1 kilometre in width. So yeah, loads of chance to see some amazing coastline. And we finished up at a town called Prince Rupert, which is up in the north, just before we got to Alaska. The great thing about this route is obviously the sea kayaking would be amazing, but because we didn't have a car, logistics of sea kayaking without a car are quite tricky because they're quite big. So you either have to do a round trip, a loop round, but luckily there was a ferry that went from Vancouver Island to Prince Rupert, our finish point, and back. So we thought it would be great. We can sea kayak as far as we can get, and then we jump on the ferry and get back to the start point. And I suppose the only problem or challenge with that is the ferry didn't run every day, and we had flights booked at the end of the trip. So it gave us a bit of pressure to crack on and not lose too much time. So this is the route in a bit more detail. So we started halfway up Vancouver Island, paddled up, and you can see at the top of Vancouver Island where the swell from the Pacific will come in, and then it ducks in again back into the islands, and the finish point, Prince Rupert, and you can see the border of the Alaskan Panhandle, that white line coming down. So we were umming and ahhing about going and tagging Alaska, but we ran out of time. So and we had an extra day to eat food at the end, which was good. So planning a trip like this, there's quite a lot to think about. Things to think about, so is the route, so what route you're going to take, how are you going to get back to the start, also where you're going to get your equipment from. So you can carry lots of things over from the UK, but things like boats and paddles, it's a little bit trickier. Also getting things to repel bears you can't fly with. So once we landed, we had to sort of rummage around Vancouver to try and find all of those things. And the start point was a bit constrained because we couldn't hire sea kayaks from everywhere. And lots of the companies north of where we started on Vancouver Island had loads of sea kayaks, but did more guiding than hire. So this was the furthest north that we could hire boats from. So that's what sort of constrained our distance. I guess the big thing to think about as well is when you're sea kayaking, the tides have a really big impact on you. Sea kayaks can travel at about 6k an hour, and the strongest tide where we were paddling is a tidal narrows called Skookumchuck, and that gets up to 30 kilometers an hour. So being able to judge how fast and when the tide is flowing is really important. And I suppose a good way to think about how the tides work is if you imagine you've got a big tomato ketchup tube, the water floods into a big fjord, which is the tomato ketchup tube. And as the tide comes out, the tomato ketchup tube gets squashed and fires the tomato sauce onto your plate. And that's the same as the sea flowing back out against you. So it's really important to get the tide information, but also know how to use that and incorporate that into your day, which we did well most of the time. I guess the weather is also makes a big difference on kayaking. And the most important thing with the weather is the wind. And again, a tailwind is obviously really, really good, as long as the tide isn't flowing against it. But paddling into a headwind is manageable, but can be quite challenging. So being able to get a reliable forecast when you're out on an expedition is really important. And I suppose the biggest unknown for us going to Canada were the bears. And we'd never paddled in a place where there were animals that would want to eat you. Maybe little animals like snakes and spiders, but nothing that would really chomp down on you. So we had to be quite careful and do some research about how we would survive the bears. And it was only really until we got to Vancouver and started chatting to the locals that we realised sort of how to manage them. So we learned that we needed pepper spray so that if they were diving and jumping towards us, we could get them. And also bear bangers, which are kind of like, do you remember those darts with like a little banger on the end? A bit like, a dart with a banger, which you would throw and it would make a sort of scare to get them away. But like most things, the best thing is to prevent them coming to camp in the first place. So we had to store all of our smelly things, so like toothpaste, food, thermals, in the sea kayak and make sure that sea kayaks were well away from camp. And hopefully the bears would never come. So we sort of felt fairly prepared. We'd done all of that prep. And on the final day, just before we left, one of the locals said, "Oh, and you know there's cougars as well." And this was a total surprise to us. And it turns out that the cougars were probably the thing that we had to worry about the most, because they actually, as opposed to coming across humans and defending, they would actually hunt us. So whenever we camped, we would be quite nervous about them, particularly Amy, because cougars would only attack smaller animals. So just try and work out how I can put this politely. Whenever Amy needed to go off into the undergrowth, she was always a bit scared that a cougar would be waiting to pounce on her. Anyway, we survived the cougars, and all the planning was done. I guess this is a good chance to mention the people that helped us as well. So a local chap, Pete Watkin, he's done loads of sea kayaking all over the world. He had done this trip, and a much longer trip as well, a few years before us. So before we went out, he gave us lots of maps and advice and pointed out some good campsites. So thanks, Pete, for all your help. And another person that was really, really helpful and really kind was Jamie. Jamie Sharp, who lives in Canada in Vancouver Island. He's a local sea kayak instructor. So he gave us loads of advice on bears and cougars and tides, and helped us with paddles as well. So thanks, Jamie, for all your support. So all of the planning done, we got to the start point, and then we realized, wow, these are our small plastic boats, and this is all of the kit that we need to take for 22 days on the water. So I think the first time we packed our boats, it took about an afternoon, because at this point we had about 10 days worth of food, all of our paddling stuff, dry clothes, anti-bear stuff, camping stuff, safety stuff, a big wad of maps that would last us for 500 miles. So we weren't quite sure if we'd get it all in, but somehow we did, and we managed to get out on the water that day. So I guess starting your trip is such a sense of relief, and the stress sort of all disappears. All the things that you think you've forgotten don't matter anymore, and what you've got is what you've got. The first few paddle strokes felt a bit weird because the boats were so heavy, but it was really great to get going. And we had planned to paddle on average a 40k a day for the 22 days, and that's what we had to do because we had a certain time window and a certain distance to get to. And maybe looking back, it was quite an ambitious target, because the first few days we were averaging about 30k, and that meant that we had to paddle more, but also didn't have any rest days to look forward to. But as time went on, our fitness grew, and we were able to average about 50k, which enabled us 2 rest days in the whole trip. So that was enjoyable. So after about a week of paddling, we got our first bit of excitement. I think we paddled about 50k, and the headwind, which normally builds through the day, was getting too strong for us to paddle against. So we saw this beach and decided to land. Pulled our boats up like normal, and I sort of wandered off into the undergrowth and found a little path that I followed to an opening which looked perfect for a tent. The only trouble was that on the floor was what looked like a disposable barbecue that had been tipped out. And after closer inspection and a bit of sniffing, we realised that it was bear droppings. So we were faced with quite a difficult decision. Do we get back on the water and paddle into a really strong headwind when we were totally knackered? Or do we risk it for a biscuit and camp there and keep everything as bear safe as we can and hope for the best? Anyway, we decided to risk it for a biscuit and camp there. So set up our tent. And the other trouble with that spot was that we'd actually decided to have a rest day the next day. So we were not just there for 12 hours, we were there for 36. So if the bear was going to come and get us, it had a lot of opportunity. So the evening went and we survived. We woke up in the morning and we had our first rest day. So what do you do on a rest day? Well, Amy chilled out, read and did some artwork, but I'm not very good at chilling out. So I decided to do some fishing. And I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but I managed to catch quite a big fish. So this was my first fish that I caught on the trip, and it was a 70 centimetre salmon. So I was obviously delighted, and we were faced with the problem of, do we put it back? Do we eat it? And so far, our diet had been pretty basic. So the thought of a few extra calories and a bit of flavour was too good to miss. So we decided that we would keep it and cook it. And I guess in the back of our minds, we knew that we were camping where her bear had been, and we knew that bear quite liked salmon, and also were quite hungry at that time as well. So this was extra nervousness onto our barometer, if that's what you can call it. Anyway, so we ate the fish and had a lovely time. And that night, we were rudely awoken by snap crackling in the woods. And Amy woke me up, and about 100 meters away, we could hear snap and a crackle of trees and leaves being broken. So we did all we could to scare whatever it was away. We made lots of noise, started shouting, started singing, and eventually the snapping and crackling eased off and slowly disappeared. So we thought that we had survived the bear. So went back to sleep, and then all was fine. Until in the morning, where we woke up, and I was busy packing the kayaks, getting all the kit sorted out, making breakfast, and Amy's job was to take the tent down. So I was out on the beach, Amy was in the woodland, and all of a sudden there was a shriek and a holler, and Amy came dashing out of the woods. I thought, oh my gosh, there's a bear going to be chasing her. So I got ready with my pepper spray, but alas, there was no need to fear. All that had happened was a tent pole had pinged up and hit Amy in the nose. So we had survived our first bear encounter. So yeah, life on the water was going really well. We were getting some good mileage in. We were enjoying some amazing scenery, and probably more than we were expecting, the passage that we took was really sheltered. So you can see in the morning here how flat the seas were. It was only until later on in the day where the winds built up that we had to stop. So we always made advantage of the morning. And as time went on, we could sort of paddle a bit longer. We would stop less for lunch, and rather than getting out, we would have lunch on the water, which enabled us to paddle a bit quicker and have more rest at the end. As I said earlier, food is very important, and it's quite tricky on a trip like this where your resupply points, the towns, are quite spread out, and you can only take a certain amount of kit in your boat. So we opted for quite high calorie, low weight, low bulk food. So lots of porridge for breakfast, wraps in peanut butter for lunch, and then either rice or pasta with some soup powder. And if we could supplement it with a fish, then that was always a bonus. But I guess, yeah, life on the water gets, when the food is as bland as that, gets quite dull. So it was always exciting when we could stop off at town and find anything a bit more interesting to eat. Yeah, so the tides were working out well. So as I was saying earlier, it was really important that you time your tides right, especially when you're paddling between islands and the channels get quite narrow, because at some times of the day, some points of the tide, you won't actually be able to make any progress. And if you can time it so the tide's going with you, that's ideal. So we had a clever app on our phone called Navionics, and that had mapping, as well as high tide and low tide, but also the tidal streams. So we could plan the night before and work out when would be the perfect time to paddle at different sections. And you can see on the back of Amy's boat there, the piranha sponge, of course, but also there's a solar panel on the back tied on. So we used a solar panel by a company called Navionics. Oh no, not Navionics, Voltaic. And so we would charge the battery during the day, and then at night we could charge our phones, charge our cameras, but also have a light to plan with. So that worked amazingly well. So we were paddling along, enjoying our day, and feeling quite sort of pleased that we'd got the weather, we'd nailed the tides, survived our bear attack. And then the next challenge, the next scare came. We were paddling past a headland, and we saw this massive dorsal fin appear out of nowhere. It's kind of hard to tell the scale, but the dorsal fin there was over 1 meter high. And we were stuck out on this headland, nowhere to go. So we just thought, right, well, we're just going to have to sit here and see what happens. So the orca got closer and closer and closer to us until it was about 10 meters away. And you can see here the orca's just swum past us, its massive dorsal fin. And as it swam past us, its eye it twisted a bit, and you could see its eye looking at us. And I don't know whether it was thinking, oh, right, I'll come back to get them later, or whether it was thinking, oh my gosh, that's a funny coloured log. But anyway, we survived our first orca. So we carried on paddling that same day. And at this point, we needed to cross from one headland to another headland. So I guess the decision is you either cut in and enjoy the view, or if you're in a bit of a rush, you beeline across. So at this particular point, we decided to beeline across just to cut off a bit of time. So we were out in the middle of this bay, and the telltale signs of whales started to appear in the air. So we started to hear and see these big puffs of water coming up. As the puffs got closer, we started to see the dorsal fins of more killer whales. And this time it was a pod of about 30 whales swimming straight towards us. So we thought, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? No idea if these whales are coming to eat us or bump us or capsize us, or if they haven't even noticed us. So we thought, right, well, we'll paddle into the bay and get away from them. But unfortunately, the killer whales also had the same idea, and they decided to hug the coast. So as we paddled in, the orcas changed their angle to swim towards us. So we were paddling like fury, trying to get away from these whales, but we couldn't do them. Their speed of them was much too much. So they must have been about 100 meters away from us at this point, and we decided, well, there's nothing we can do. We're just going to have to sit here and accept our fate, let the orca decide what they want to do with us. So they got closer and closer until they were about 10 meters away. And by that time, you can smell their puffs, and you could see all of the tiny orca, the mum orca, and the bull orca as well. So it was obviously a massive family pod. So they swam straight towards us, and I was expecting a free willy moment for us to be able to put our hands up and touch them as they jumped over. Luckily, they swam under us, up the other side, and disappeared off. And that was one of the moments on the expedition where you just sit there and you just think, oh my gosh, this is amazing that we're in this situation. And I guess a chance that only would happen with sea kayaks. If you're in a motorboat or a cruise ship, there's no way that the orca would come that close to you. So we felt really fortunate to be in that situation. And after this experience, we thought, oh, well, it'd be really good to learn a bit more about the orca. So Amy is a really good researcher, and she started looking in to the orca. And we learned that there's two kinds of orca that frequent the sort of Vancouver Island area. There's transient orca and resident orca. And this was a resident orca pod, and they stay in the waters all year round. They feed on salmon, and they swim around in big family pods. So this pod was about 30. And the amazing thing about family pods is they will speak to each other and all have the same dialect. So it would be like a Glaswegian pod and an Edinburgh pod and a Dundee pod. And sometimes they would communicate with each other, but often they would stay apart and spend their lives in their family group. The other kind of killer whale is the transients, and we know a lot less about them because they spend a lot of time out at sea. And rather than feeding on salmon, they migrate around, and they're more interested in big mammals. So they eat dolphins, porpoise, also sharks as well. They eat birds. And amazingly, they eat deer as well. And only when the deer are swimming from island to island, it's been known that the transient orca has come and gobbled up a deer. So that's probably why they're called killer whales, because they've been seen to be eating and biting much bigger things than just the fish. So carrying on the wildlife vibe, this was the sort of the next thing that we saw that was really exciting. This is the tail of a humpback whale. And these are the biggest mammals, the biggest whales that frequent the Vancouver Island waters. And we weren't really expecting to see many orca or whales, to be honest. But as time progressed and the further north we got, we ended up seeing more and more and more. And these would travel around sort of in ones and twos, and they feed on krill and plankton. So we were a little bit less worried about them. But still, always quite an excitement to see them. And this was probably the closest we got to a humpback whale. And again, we were paddling from headland to headland, just past a small bay. And we were paddling along, and all of a sudden, this big puff from the shore side of us, about 10 meters away from us, happened. And I think what had happened is we had disturbed or woken up a sleeping humpback. So the poor thing had a bit of a fright, puffed out, and then swam out from behind us. And I guess for us, it was an amazing experience to be so close to the animal, but it made us really question what our impact was on the animals and the wildlife that we were seeing. So from then on, obviously we enjoyed seeing them, but we did feel a little bit guilty and tried to avoid the big animals as much as we could. But some animals were quite difficult to avoid, and the sea lions were definitely one of them. This was our first encounter with the sea lions, and from paddling in Scotland, I've been used to experiencing seals, and you kind of paddle along to seals and give them a wide berth, but they're normally quite chilled out and not that aggressive. But these sea lions were all sleeping on the rock, and as we were paddling past, one of them woke up and sort of looked up at us and bared its teeth and made an alrighty roar, and we thought, oh my gosh, what's going on? And he woke up all of his mates, and then suddenly they swam towards us and then ducked underwater, and we thought, oh flip, like where have they all gone? What's going to happen? Are they going to come and jump over our boats or bite our paddles? Anyway, so we just absolutely paddled away as fast as we could. And from then on, we were quite nervous about sea lions, and often paddling past a headland, there would be a couple of sea lions, and they would see you, swim towards you, and then duck underwater. And there'd always be that nagging doubt as to, oh my gosh, where have they gone? What are they going to do to us? So yeah, quite scary as well. Not all of the wildlife was scary though. Some of them were a lot more enjoyable and a lot more tame. So it was always nice to see starfish. And this is probably the densest starfish crew we saw. And often underwater, but I guess the tide must have been out, so they were left high and dry. But the water was so clear on the inside passage that we could see a lot of stuff underwater. So it was always really nice to see some happy starfish. And finally, the sea eagles. And we get them in Scotland. It's a real treat in Scotland to see a sea eagle. And also in Lofoten, we saw quite a lot of them. And the same on the west coast of Canada, you get lots of them. And they feed on lots of the fish there. So yeah, we would often be paddling along, and up in the tree or down on a rocky beach, we would see a sea eagle. Obviously quite difficult to capture on camera, but this was when we paddled round the corner and they were just there eating a fish on the side. So again, we felt guilty for disturbing them, but it was a real privilege to be up close and personal with them. Yeah, so I guess expedition life was going well. We were about halfway through the trip at this point, and we were enjoying remarkably good weather. So I think until this point, we hadn't had any rainy day where you think, oh my gosh, I don't want to get out of the camp. I don't want to have to cook food outside. We'd had really dry weather. And that was obviously great. But the only problem was, because the weather was dry and there was no rain, there was no water in the rivers. And because there's no water in the rivers, none of the salmon could make it up and away from the sea, which meant that the bears were hungry. So we had this added worry that, oh my gosh, the bears haven't eaten any salmon this season. They're going to be completely starving, which added to our bear phobia even more. We found some really good campsites as well. And it's always tricky to know where to camp when you're paddling near the end of the day. Do you camp here on this medium, sort of fairly okay bit? And often in the morning, you paddle off again round the corner and you find an even better campsite. So it's always tricky to know where to camp. But when you get to a beach like this, it's a really easy decision. You can hang up your gear, camp on a really flat area, and have no worries at all. But sometimes you get to a spot and you think, well, we really do need to camp here. And this was a classic example. So here we landed on this rocky beach, and the woodland was too thick for us to get anywhere near pitching a tent in the undergrowth. So we started by pitching our tent as high as we could on the beach. And at about midnight, we sort of heard this lapping of water. We thought, oh my gosh, the tide is coming in. It must be really close to us. And it was spring tide at that moment. So we peered out of the tent, and the tide had come in to about a foot away from our tent. So we sort of panicked and thought, oh my gosh, well, it's coming in, it's still coming in even more. So we're going to have to move. So we ended up sleeping on this horribly uncomfortable rock. But it was fine. Probably the worst campsite spot that we found. But I guess on an expedition like this, you just need to make do with what you get. We were really enjoying the simple routine of our trip. Unlike normal life, where you've got loads of distractions and loads of stuff going on, all you need to do on a trip like this is wake up in the morning, eat your porridge, pack your boats, paddle, eat your lunch, land, set your camp up, eat dinner and sleep. Plan the next day. So it was a really nice sort of simple routine to get into. And you get quite efficient as well. So Amy was queen of the tent. I was queen of making the dinner. And we'd get packing up in the morning down to a pretty slick routine as well. But on a trip like this, you spend so much time outdoors, it's really hard not to notice the environment that you're traveling through. Lots of places that we've paddled before, there's lots of ocean plastic and litter and things on the beach. But amazingly, in the inside passage, probably because it's protected from all of the stuff that floats in from out to sea, we didn't see much marine plastic at all. But what we did see was lots of logs. So most beaches that we pulled up onto, there were these massive tree trunks. And whether that was because trees would fall into the sea, but probably more likely because there's a big logging industry in Canada, and they use the rivers to float logs out to the big ports. I imagine a few logs would have broken free. So sometimes at camp, you'd have to climb up and over and drag your boats up and over these logs to land. Just to give you a bit of a flavour of what expedition life was like, Amy has prepared a short video, which I will play just now for you.
Uh-oh. What time is it?
Lunchtime.
Woo!
That's a wrap.
Waterfalls and chocolate. What's the time?
Lunchtime.
Second lunchtime.
Wrap time.
In West Philadelphia.
I'm going in for a swim.
Swim, 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 swim.
First wash in 12 days.
Oosh. Ooh. Just trying to do a peaceful Sudoku. And someone catches a fish. There we go. Catch it? A little bit of paradise. On the road again. Da, 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 da. Oh, Jonny. There's two of you. Whoa. Is that good?
Slightly off a bit of the vest. I think we'll be alright.
Great. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a taste of what expedition life was like. Lots of catching fish and fun and games. So I guess it's got to be a fun trip to be an enjoyable trip as well. I suppose we've talked a little bit about the environmental impact that we noticed in the whilst we were paddling. And I suppose the biggest thing that we saw was the fishing industry. And the fishing has been a massive part of the economy for Canada from sort of the late 1800s. And back then they would have lots and lots of small boats that would go out and catch loads of fish. And they would put them in cans because transport was quite slow. So the first cannery was built in 1876. And interestingly, for the Scots amongst us, it was called the Inverness Cannery. So obviously a big Scottish influence over there. And then by 1918, there were 80 canning factories up and down the coast. And I suppose sort of technology's changed, and we've not needed, because of refrigeration, we've not needed the canning factories now. So it's dropped right down to one remaining canning factory. And I guess the great thing about that factory is it's in Nanaimo, which is a town that we paddled past. But importantly, it's owned by the First Nations community. Yeah, which is great. So now for Canada, fishing and seafood is the largest export of all food types out there, in particular lobster and salmon. And the great thing about the big industry out there is it supports around 72,000 jobs for Canadian people, be it catching the fish or distributing it. So it's a really boost for their economy. And I suppose the biggest sector is the salmon farming. So as we were paddling, we paddled past lots of salmon farms, and we're familiar with them in Scotland as well, and also in Norway as well. And I suppose the salmon farms are really important socially and economically, as they provide lots of jobs for the local people. And in Canada, it makes a lot of sense as well for them to make lots of money off the sea and off fish, because they've got it's the country with the longest coastline. They've got the most fresh water out of all countries, and also a really big tidal range. So a lot of movement of water, which means that you can you get lots of fish, but also you can farm lots of fish as well. And around 8,000 jobs are created through salmon farms. And the important thing about these jobs is that they're located in rural coastal areas. I think about 90% of these jobs are rural and coastal. So in terms of supporting the local towns that are on the coast, it's really important. And I suppose with a growing population in the world, there's a growing need for food. So it's really important that we come up with neat ways of producing a lot of food, but hopefully minimizing the environmental cost that produces. And I suppose there's definitely mixed opinions on whether salmon farms are good. There's obviously all the benefits that I've talked about economically and socially, but they do have a bit of an environmental impact. And I suppose the biggest two factors are that because the salmon are farmed so intensively, sea lice is quite common, and the fish are fed and given lots of medicine to sort of help them survive. But what happens with the sea lice is that when migratory wild salmon swim past the pens, the sea lice jump across and end up on the wild salmon as well. And the other big problem is that because it's such an intensively farmed area, a lot of food drops to the ground, but a lot of waste, a lot of salmon droppings lands on the sea floor, and that creates a real big impact for the local sea area. Oops. So local communities have quite a polarized view. On one hand, they welcome the local employment, and it provides much needed money. But on the other hand, the local sort of First Nations community hold wild salmon in quite high esteem, and it's entrenched with them quite in their culture quite significantly. So the fact that the evidence suggests that the salmon farms are reducing or contributing to the reduction of wild salmon is a bit of a challenge for them. But there's lots of positive stuff happening. So the Canadian minister just recently has said that he wants to move salmon farms away from the migratory rivers and put them a bit further away. The First Nations communities are gaining more ownership of the decision making in terms of where the salmon farms are put. So that's great to empower them. And one of the local First Nations communities called the Nagamis have just started a on-land salmon farm. And this is brilliant because it means that the sea lice isn't transmitted to wild salmon, and the waste that's produced can be contained, but it's a lot more expensive to produce the salmon, and there's increased environmental cost in terms of the energy that's required to produce the salmon. So like with most things involving conservation, there's no easy golden bullet to solve the problem. But the future's looking great. Norway are investing in semi-closed containment systems where There's an impermeable barrier, so sea lice isn't transmitted. And the moving this salmon farms onto land as well is possibly going to be a good solution if they can work out how to do that without using a lot of energy. So I suppose so far I've talked about all the good bits of the trip, but not all of expedition paddling is good. And this is kind of a typical scene for lots of our crossings, where we had to paddle from one island to the next. You've got a tidal flow moving across sideways, and when the visibility is low like this, your navigation's got to be quite accurate. And it can be quite scary and a little bit daunting setting off, not having anything to point at, but just a compass bearing to paddle on, and to hope that your tidal planning has worked out. Also, as you're crossing these stretches in the mist, there's lots of massive boats that come up and down, and fishing boats as well with big nets out. And when the visibility is down to about 50 meters, you kind of hope that they're looking out, but there's always that worry when you hear a nearby boat that they're going to bear down on you from behind and do something bad. So I guess this is an artist impersonation or an artist impression of one of the moments that we experienced. Often when the water's too choppy to paddle in, it's hard to take photos as well. But this happened where we had a really strong tailwind pushing us along really quickly, and we came to a stream where kind of a river was coming out. And you get this horrible kind of wind against tide feeling where the waves get pushed up a lot bigger than they were. And because the wind was coming from behind, we were surfing down these waves. And as per usual, it's always at the end of the day when the wind picks up. So this was a really scary time with a lot of tide, a lot of wind. And if something had gone wrong, like one of us had capsized, it'd be a really dangerous situation to have to deal with. Great. But loads of really cool moments as well. So paddling past waterfalls like this, having amazing views like this with the trees, the mountains, the porpoise, a pod of porpoise coming to say hello. And again, food keeps cropping up. But whenever we stopped at a town to resupply, we would try and find the greasiest looking cafe and buy the biggest, greasiest looking meal. So this is a Canadian favourite, poutine, which is basically chips and gravy and then a cheese curd. And this didn't feel like naughty eating at all because we were losing so much weight, we couldn't eat enough. So it was really, really tasty. And I guess it was fun as well. It was really nice to paddle with Amy, to spend a month with her. And I think we made a really good team. There were moments where we had to share decision making, some scary moments, some fun moments. We each sort of knew what jobs to do. So I thought we worked really well together. And moments like this, paddling past lighthouses when the sun's out, the water's flat, is a really memorable experience. And I guess finally, the camping as well. We managed to camp 21 times, so 21 campsites. And this was one of my favorites, a tiny island. And the tide came in actually until it was about a meter away from our camp. But we sort of thought, well, the great thing about camping on an island is that there's no bears. There's no way that they're going to get us. Little did we know that bears can actually swim. And if a bear had come, we would have nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. So in retrospect, I don't know if it was such a good idea. But all too soon, we got to Prince Rupert, our finish point. And it was quite a contrast from paddling in this wilderness area, past and stopping off at small villages, to this massive industry, to the big port there. So we rounded the corner into the marina, pulled our boats out, and this was us, the end of the trip. We were really, really pleased to have made good time. We had an amazing time and we had a day left. And what do you do after an expedition? Eat all of the food. So I reckon if you lose weight on a trip, it's an expedition. If you gain weight on a trip, it's a holiday. And this trip was definitely an expedition. So at the end of the trip, all we could do was sit on our asses, sleep lots and eat lots as well. So for the boat ride home, it took 24 hours to the journey, what took us 22 days. And it was a really great chance to reflect upon the trip, look at all the campsites, look at some of the wildlife as well. But the funny thing was, Amy survived 22 days on the sea without feeling seasick at all. But unfortunately, and she said I could mention this, unfortunately, she spent the whole time with her head in the toilet with seasickness. So got back to Vancouver, had time to sort of chill out, meet Jamie again, and just to get my whitewater fix. Jamie was kind enough to take me out on a few of the local Vancouver runs. So nice to kind of wash all the kit off before flying home. Thanks very much for listening. I hope I didn't talk too quickly, and I hope you were able to understand what I was saying. And I think there's various questions coming in on the chat box. So yeah, I'm happy to sort of hang around and answer a few of those. So if you do have any questions, you can pop them in the chat box now. And a bit of self-promotion, I run an outdoor company called the Highland Adventure School. So if you're looking for any outdoor instruction, sea kayaking, whitewater kayaking, climbing, winter walking, then you can have a look at that and we can go on an adventure.
Okay. Okay, that's brilliant, Jonny. Thank you so much. That's really, as you say, a real adventure and expedition. And there are some questions that have come through. I mean, a lot of comments that were being made along the way, particularly about your singing and the effect that would have on the bears. You needn't have worried at all. One interesting question, though, is around just the basics of finding fresh water. I mean, was there plenty of that?
Oh, yeah,
good.
good.
It was easy to find. There weren't never any difficulties.
Yeah, good question. So we would have about, I think it was 60 litres of water that we could capacity. And I guess that's 60 kilos, so 30 kilos per boat. So as soon as you top up on water, the boat's going to feel really, really different. But whenever we went to a village, we would top up with fresh water. And I think only once. Oh yeah, because sometimes if there wasn't a village, we would see a house that we could nip up and say, can we fill our water up? But once we had to fill up from a stream. So we used, I think it was iodine. We put iodine in the water to purify it, making it safe to drink.
Okay. Well, I think iodine's now not deemed to be.
Oh, it's probably naughty, is it? Oh
That's a naughty thing
dear.
to do. But you've survived.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned about the weight of the kayaks with all your stuff in it and with the water as well. I mean, presumably that had a lot in the balance. And
Yeah.
if you had any swell or any sort of rough weather, it must have been really tricky just to catch. And I mean, how did that? I mean, did you get into that after a while, paddling and become more confident? But
yeah, it was amazing the difference before a village when your food stocks are quite low and your water's quite low, your boat's quite high and you can paddle quite quickly. But as soon as you've resupplied and got loads of water on again, your boat's quite heavy and it takes a bit more time to build up speed. But once you're up to speed, because sea kayaks are so efficient in terms of their shape, you can actually continue that speed quite well. And I suppose we didn't experience too much chop. Only in that artist impersonation. And when the boats are heavy, they actually punch through the waves as opposed to going up and over. So the lighter the boat, the better. But on a trip like this, you are going to have a heavy boat. And I suppose the other challenge with a heavy boat is landing and launching. So we ended up not landing or launching at lunchtime, which meant we just had to do it sort of once a day. And it's just a case of helping each other out, unloading all the kit and getting it all sort of carried up to the high tide line in any means possible.
no, the couple of related questions here. I mean, Kirsty's asking, could you got any thoughts about what a good first expedition around Scotland would be?
Oh gosh, oh my gosh, so many good options. It's been what would be a good first expedition? I suppose it depends how much paddling you've done. So there's loads of really cool sea kayaking that you can do on inland lochs. And the great thing about inland lochs is there's no tide. The conditions are going to be a lot calmer, but you can still experience that wilderness. You can camp on islands. And the great thing about paddling in Scotland as well is because we've got the outdoor access code is that you don't have to gain permission as well. So as long as you camp responsibly, so don't have fires, take away all of your litter, you can camp and explore as much as you want. But I guess when you get on the sea, have an overnight trip, pick somewhere that's sheltered, that's not too windy, and do your research as well. So there's lots of guidebooks, chat to more experienced people, and they'll give you some really good ideas as to where to go and what the tides are going to be like and what equipment to take as well.
Good. And the related question was from James McLean. Was, how much experience do you think you need to have before taking on an expedition like the Inside Passage? Because you were saying you haven't done much sea kayaking.
Right.
But,
yeah. So another good question. And it's kind of a hard one. I mean, you can, the great thing about the Inside Passage is the shelter that you get. And you actually, the conditions that you experience, depending on which sections that you pick, don't have to be that troublesome. And I guess at one end of the spectrum, as a total new person, you can book on a trip from somewhere like Telegraph Cove, and you can paddle for a week. You can camp, you can see Orca, you can see whales. The person will do all the navigating, so you don't have to have any experience, all the way through to planning your own trip. And so myself and Amy have probably done maybe 100 days of sea kayaking on the water. And that's in a lot of different conditions, and we've got qualifications. So yeah, that might be a rough guide, but the least experience you have, the more adventurous it will be, whether that's good or not.
The more reckless.
Yeah.
Okay, and Jonathan Riddle, which somebody I think you know, he's asking about the emergency equipment that you had, and in particular sort of the comms and evacuation plan. So did you have communication, satellite phones or whatever? Yeah,
good question. Hello, Jonathan. How's it going? So what did we take? So we had flares. So I guess if something goes wrong immediately, it's a really good way of calling for help with local boats. We took a VHF as well, and that's a way of communicating slightly further afield, and you can call in a rescue with that as long as you've got signal. And then the belt and braces, we had a spot unit, and that was really good because each evening we could check in and show our parents where we were and that we were okay. But also, if everything goes wrong, again, you don't need VHF signal because it relies on GPS. So any point of that trip, if we had a big problem, we could press the big red button and help would come. And I suppose we had a first aid kit as well to solve problems that we encountered.
Tent poles in the face.
Yeah.
Okay. And so actually, Giles Shepherd's popped up with suggesting the Great Glen is a pretty well set up for a medium expedition, is it? Yeah, great. Hello, Giles. How's it going? Really good idea. And you can, people paddle it in a day, I think, maybe, up to 5 days. So, and especially if you go from Fort William to Inverness, you have a tailwind. That's a great idea. A really good option, Giles. Yeah. There's a question talking about tailwinds that you described a journey from south to north. You talked about the winds picking up in the afternoons and being headwinds. Yeah. And is south to north sort of the conventional way to do it, right, and the obvious way to do it? Is that all? Yeah, no, a good. So I suppose when we were doing our research, there was no one answer as to which way it was best to paddle. Whichever way you go, you think you're getting more headwind than tailwind because you feel the headwinds. Certainly at the first half of the journey, it would either be flat calm or the headwinds would start. And then it felt like the second half of the journey, we got more tailwinds. So difficult to say. But I suppose for us, it was quite nice because we started in quite an urban area, and the further north we got, the more remote it felt. So in terms of sort of the feeling of the trip, it worked out quite well for us going from south to north. Don and Judith Walker are just asking about the tent, what type of tent you had. Just explain that, the size of it. What was it? A well-known brand? Right, yeah. To promote? It was a very violent tent, but so I suppose with tents, there's always a balance with equipment. Do you go super lightweight and small, so you can carry more kit, or do you have a slightly bigger, bulkier, sturdier tent? So we went for a 3-man tent, which meant that we had enough space that we could get the maps out and do our planning in the night. And also, if it was wet, we could hide and sort of cook in the porch. And because you're sea kayaking, weight isn't such a problem. So compared with if you're walking, we would have probably gone for a 2-man tent. But because we had the space, we thought it's worth investing and taking a slightly bigger tent. Okay. Yeah. Emily is asking about getting the right balance between documenting the trip and taking those super photos and so on, but then being in the moment. Good. Was that? Yeah, very good question. So it's
always very tricky. I suppose the best thing would be to leave all of your technology at home and just enjoy the moment. And I suppose one particular moment when we were talking about the Orca swimming under us, we were obviously experiencing the Orca. I was there getting my camera out. Amy had a GoPro in her hand, trying to document it so that we could share it afterwards. And it definitely takes away from that experience. So kind of after that moment, we said, if we haven't got the cameras out and an Orca comes or a humpback comes, let's just enjoy it and make the most of the moment. But always when you get back, like when I was putting this talk together, oh, I wish I had a picture on this. I wish I had a picture on that. So that's the other side of the story. It's a great memory and a good way to share what you've been up to when you get back. So yeah, a tricky balance.
Yeah. And how much opportunity did you get to chat to local folks? You talked about going into the villages and for resupplies and so on, but did you get much of interaction with, because you were talking about the kind of the local economy and particularly the controversy around salmon farming, which is the same here and everywhere. So
so as we were paddling, and we would often try and camp in remote locations just because it was more enjoyable. But I suppose the times that we met people were at the start and the end. So meeting people like Jamie, who gave us a really good insight into sort of the sea kayaking culture out there. And then whenever we stopped at towns or villages, we would meet people. And I guess one good example would be, I think it was in Clem 2, which is a First Nations town. We had just done our shop, and we always bought cinnamon buns when we did our shop because they were so tasty. So we were scoffing our cinnamon buns, sat on a bench, and then a lady came down and sat next to us. And she started sharing kind of what it's like to be a First Nations person. And it was quite sad in a way because I suppose before the European settlers arrived, they were quite happy doing their own thing, living by their culture. But as soon as outside cultures and you get that cultural mix, things change. And it was quite sad to hear the level of unemployment in those places, and also I guess the associated social problems that comes with that. So that was kind of a sad bit of a dampener, and something that we hadn't really sort of expected to come across.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Okay, there's a couple of questions here. Dave McQueen, hi David. Just saying fantastic talk, and he just wants to know if you could return to any one of the amazing places that you've been to for your canoeing and kayaking. Have you got any? You can only go to one more trip. Where would you?
So returning.
That's optimism for you.
Yeah. Where would return to? I guess I really enjoyed New Zealand, and Amy and I made some really good friends out there. So it'd be really nice to go back. And there's loads more missions that we fancy out there. And I suppose a place that I've not been that I'd really like to go is been quite interesting with the lockdown happening and the travel restrictions. It's kind of made me think a bit more about, and I suppose the environmental cost of traveling made me think a bit more about foreign trips and flying and things. But there's loads of things in Scotland that I really want to do. So I guess in terms of sea kayaking, it'd be really nice to paddle around Skye. I'm a purist, so I quite like paddling round things back from the start to the starting and finishing at the same point. And also the Outer Hebrides is amazing. And we're lucky as sea kayakers in Scotland because the coastline is so varied and we've got such amazing wildlife and scenery. So you don't really have to travel abroad to experience world-class sea kayaking in Scotland, which is great.
But you did mention to me Nepal was pretty amazing.
Oh, well, I'd love to go back to Nepal. Yeah.
So that actually the next big adventure. Have you got another big adventure?
So nothing abroad planned at the moment. I suppose those two trips, so paddling around Skye and the Outer Hebrides would be amazing. It's been quite nice getting out in the canoe recently. So just done a few quite cool trips in Scotland in the canoe. And for me, I suppose I like the outdoor adventure. I like the social thing, meeting up with people. But it's exploring new places, and the canoe and the sea kayak are kind of a bit easier to explore new places. And certainly whitewater kayaking, you've got to work for it a bit more. So yeah, maybe just exploring a bit more around Scotland would be really nice.
And it's definitely paddling ahead of skiing or climbing.
Gosh. Yeah. So well, definitely. Yeah, I've done more paddling, but really like rock climbing as well. So we've got a few trip ideas for rock climbing at some point in the future that we'd like to do.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think, I've been saving this as the final question. It's Rory Munro that's asking. And we were anticipating that there might be a question about your shirt.
Trust
He
Rory.
wants to see more of it.
Hello, Rory.
He wants to know where he can get one.
So this is a New Zealand op shop specialty. I think it was from Wanaka Wastebusters for about $3. So if you're ever in New Zealand, Rory, you'll know where to go.
Probably go to Lansing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Yeah. Thanks again, Jonny. That's been an absolutely brilliant talk, and it's clearly had loads of comments and remarks coming in, as well as the questions, just saying how fantastic it's been. Wonderful talk, thanks. Really interesting talk, thanks very much. There's just loads of them coming in. Charles Shepherd has just posted, it's not a beta, Rory, you're not allowed to wear it. That's fantastic. No, thanks a lot. It's brilliant, and there's a lot of work goes into planning. I mean, clearly not as much work that goes into the actual trip itself, but to planning and putting together the presentation. So we are really grateful for you. So thanks very much indeed. It's brilliant. And that really draws it to a close for tonight. Our talk. This is our last talk before Christmas, but we will be back in February. So if you want to mark your diaries, the 8th of February and the 22nd of February, we've got a couple of great speakers lined up then. One who's taken a motorbike from Argentina to Alaska, and we also have a really good climber who's been up Everest a few times, along with many other 8,000 meter peaks. So a couple of really good talks in February to look forward to. So stay well, stay safe, enjoy Christmas, and thanks very much for supporting us. Good night.